Diabetes Connections is brought to you by One Drop, created for people with diabetes by people who have diabetes, and by Dexcom. Take control of your diabetes and live life to the fullest with Dexcom.
This is Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
This week, Tandem presented new studies at the recent ADA conference and got approval for some of the youngest people with diabetes to use their newest technology. But Tandem is also keeping a close eye on including many more people in future studies.
It's a shared responsibility across many communities to figure out how to make it easier for different types of people to be included in this research.
That's Steph Habif, Tandem's Senior Director of Behavioral Sciences. We'll talk more about what communities she means there and why Tandem wants to reach out more. And of course, we talk about Control IQ and what's next for Tandem. In Tell Me Something Good, great news about college scholarships for students with type 1. This podcast is not intended as medical advice. If you have those kinds of questions, please contact your healthcare provider. Welcome to another week of Diabetes Connections. I am so glad to have you along. I am your host, Stacey Sims. We aim to educate and inspire about diabetes by sharing stories of connection. And this time of year, we are sharing a lot of stories about technology and studies. And that is because the American Diabetes Association Scientific Sessions Conference has recently concluded. So every year at this time, there's new information. Sometimes it is also timed with FDA approvals like we saw last week with the Libre 2 and with Tandem's approval that we're going to talk about for the Control IQ software to be used down to age 6. It means a lot of information. It means some bonus episodes. It means some playing with the schedule because just trying to get this information out in podcast form can be a little bit more difficult. But, that's what I am here for and what I love to do. If you're new, my son was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes right before he turned 2. My husband lives with type 2 diabetes. I don't have diabetes. I have a background in broadcasting and local radio and television news, and that is how you get this podcast. And just a quick note about my son, Benny. I realized the other day, so we're 13 and a half years in with type 1, which means we're coming up July 4th time on his 13-year anniversary of wearing an insulin pump, which I cannot believe. And I remember it like it was yesterday. So I'm going to maybe do an episode or talk about that in another episode, looking back on what's changed and, how to pick an insulin pump and all that kind of stuff. But oh my gosh, I can't believe he's 15. Oh. Speaking of Benny, the world's worst diabetes mom is now available in more places. My publisher reached out to me. We are now sold online at Target and Barnes & Noble and pretty much expanding to every place you can buy a book online. I didn't realize this was a thing that we started on Amazon and now we are elsewhere, which shows that it's a good thing that I have these people to help me out. But it's also available in library form. And I'm still investigating this. So as you listen, if you get ebooks, that's the library form. It would have to be an ebook, Kindle or something like that. If you have a service that gets you library books, check it out and let me know where it is, because I haven't been able to exactly track that down. And with COVID, I think there's some issues. I'm trying to get the hard copy into libraries too. So that's something that you could really help me out with. And I have to give a big shout out to Molly Cooper. Molly lives in the UK. She sent me a message that she really enjoyed the book. It was so nice of her to reach out like that. So, of course, I asked her a little bit about it. I have some UK readers, but I'm interested in the process. There's a different Amazon site for different countries. So, I was just interested in how it all worked. And then she posted in one of the diabetes parenting Facebook groups that she belonged in. And oh my gosh, Molly, thank you so much. A bunch of people talked about the book, and it was such a nice thing for you to do. So if you've read and enjoyed The World's Worst Diabetes Mom, I always ask, please leave a review on Amazon. That helps so much when people are looking to see if they want to buy the book or get the book. But if you could also post in your Facebook group or on your timeline about it and tag me, but it would be so helpful to spread the word because let's face it, this isn't going to show up in the New York Times review of books, right? We have the community to spread the word. And it may be immodest to say, but I do think it's a book that can help people. It's not just our story. There's a lot of advice in there and a lot of learning that I did over the years. I believe very much in it, and I really appreciate those of you who are already spreading the word. If you read it and you don't like it, forget you know me. In just a moment, I'm going to be talking to Tandem's Steph Habif about Control IQ, new studies, and lots more. But first, Diabetes Connections is brought to you by One Drop. And getting diabetes supplies, it's a pain, let's face it. Not only the ordering, the picking up, the arguing with insurance over what they say you need and what you really need. Make it easy with OneDrop. They offer personalized test strip plans, plus you get a Bluetooth glucose meter, test strips, lancets, and your very own certified diabetes coach. Subscribe today to get test strips for less than $20 a month, delivered right to your door. No prescriptions, no copays required. One less thing to worry about. Not that surprising when you learn the founder of OneDrop lives with type 1. They get it. OneDrop, gorgeous gear, supplies delivered to your door, 24/7 access to your certified diabetes coach. Learn more, go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the OneDrop logo. My guest this week is Steph Habif. She is the Senior Director of Behavioral Sciences at Tandem, which means she really advocates for the people who use the technology. She presented some of the studies we're going to be talking about at ADA and of course, has presented elsewhere. And a quick note, if you are new to the show, we use the Tandem system. They're not a sponsor of the show, but I know I am biased toward Tandem. So I want to make that disclosure first thing. I just love the way it works. Look, it's not perfect. Nothing is. But we have been using Tandem for 3 years now. We switched from Animas insulin pump in August of 2017, just as the Dexcom G5 update was approved for Tandem. So basically, we got a pump, and then we immediately updated the software. We have done 2 other updates, the Basal IQ last year, and we went to Control IQ in late January, pretty much just as it hit the market. I cannot believe it has been 6 months already. So while I don't think that influenced the actual questions I'm asking, it certainly influences how I feel about the system. So here is my interview with Tandem's Steph Habif. Steph, thank you for joining me. I'm so excited to talk about Tandem and learn more. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. I've been a listener of yours for a while, so it's a real pleasure.
Oh, thank you very much. This year's ADA, very different. May I start by just asking you what that was like for you to present and have to do everything virtually?
Yeah, it was definitely, I think, a unique and interesting experience for a lot of us, especially people who regularly attend the ADA each year. And I'm not going to lie, my favorite part about the event is getting to see people and kind of have the very energized, creative conversations together in person. I think a lot of brainstorming and some of the best ideas birth from, getting together with colleagues from all over the world at meetings like that. So that part was kind of missing, obviously, this year. But given what's happening in the world, I think it was put on fabulously well, produced really, really nicely. The excitement leading up to the conference was there. That was a part of my experience this year for sure, like every year. And then it all happened through email and chat and text. So my eyes hurt at the end of the conference. I think my eyesight has taken a little bit of a hit in the past couple months, like a lot of other people. But there was some very exciting information that got presented.
Yeah, let's talk about some of that. We've talked about Control IQ in depth before its launch or right as it was launched. Tell us about some of the presentations here. I know one of them was Control IQ in the real world, the first 30 days. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so that was a proud moment for me and my team, the scientific posters that we presented at this year's ADA. I think one of the people you have had on your podcast to talk about Control IQ is Molly McElmy-Molloy, and she's on my team here at Tandem. We get to work together. She was one of the researchers whose name was on these presentations at ADA. And the first 30 days, that was really our first look under the hood, so to speak. So one of the things that my team here at Tandem is responsible for is post-market surveillance and user experience research, meaning once the FDA approves or clears a medical device like the t:slim X2 and people start using it in their everyday lives, the job of my team is to observe, measure, learn how's that going for people, whether it has to do with their glycemic outcomes like time in range, or quality of life things like how's your sleep? Those are all the things that we're responsible for researching and studying. Now, what we did for ADA was we didn't have very much time with Control IQ in the market before the ADA deadline presented itself. So Control IQ came to the U.S. market starting mid-January. And we had to have all of our materials submitted to ADA by the second week of March. Wow. So not a lot of time. So like I said, sort of first look under the hood, meaning we went into our databases, into our T-Connect web application, backend systems, and we used some research methodologies to kind of see how it was going for people. What sort of glycemic trends and outcomes were we seeing for the early adopters right out of the gate? And we specifically focused on folks who software updated. So I think Benny is a software updater. He was on Basal IQ leading up to Control IQ. And how old is Benny again?
He's 15.
15. So he was probably included in our analyses, actually.
I'm so sorry. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah,
wow.
So anybody who was age 14 or older and had at least 21 days of use on Control IQ technology leading up to March 11th was included in this analysis. So
yeah, he was. He was definitely in there. And you would have seen a great response, I don't mind telling you.
Yeah, so this information that we presented at ADA, like I said, we didn't have that much time. So really data mining to look at glycemic outcomes. So it was a retrospective data analysis exercise, essentially, which is a very common thing to do when it's your first look at sort of what's happening in the real world. And we were really pleased to discover that overall real world users are experiencing an increase in time in range of 10%. Before updating to Control IQ, the folks in this study had a time in range of about 68%. And throughout their first 30 days on Control IQ, they experienced an increase to get that overall time in range metric to 78%. And what's exciting about that is that 10% jump matches what we saw in our Control IQ clinical trial.
Did you have any data about ease of use? In other words, did people continuously use it? Did people have sensor issues? Did people have problems figuring out how to adjust anything? I know it's tough to glean in such a short time. I'm just curious if you learned anything else.
So for the purpose of what we presented at ADA, we kind of kept it really simple. Again, because we didn't have very much time. We mined data. We worked with what was available to us. And so we really focused on things like changes in time in range, hyperglycemia, hypoglycemia. And we didn't, for the purposes of what was presented at ADA, talk about quality of life, things like sleep improvement. But what we do know is that for the folks who were included in this analysis, overall, they experienced the percent of time in closed loop automation was 96%. And that's really exciting. Now, for the Control IQ technology system, the only reason a user isn't in automation is if they lose connection with their CGM for 20 or more minutes. That's it. And then once CGM is reconnected, automatically you're back in that automation closed loop. So that's really elegant and simple. And that came through in these metrics that we presented at ADA.
Yeah, so that's interesting. I mean, not to jump to a conclusion, but let me just make sure I'm hearing you right. So we can pretty much conclude if 96% of people using if people using Control IQ stayed using it 96% of the time in automation, that means that their sensors were working, that things were chugging along just as they should.
Yes. And thank you for bringing that up. So we have some consensus guidelines on data integrity for this type of research. When you're doing real world research like this, the guideline is, for the purposes of data integrity, to include CGM rates that are 70 to 75% or above. So what that means is in our analyses for the ADA, we included people who had at least 75% CGM connectivity over that 60-day period.
I see.
Now, in the clinical trial for Control IQ, the investigators reported CGM connectivity in the high 90s. That was a way that we could sort of control for that variable, given that we were doing a retrospective data analysis, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does, because it's really important, and you know this, people in the diabetes community, there's separate issues here, right? There's Control IQ, there's the Tandem pump, but there's the Dexcom sensors, which, listen, it's not a Dexcom interview here, but we've talked a lot on this podcast about people who just have trouble with the sensors and sensor failures and things. So I'm glad to hear you clarify, because I'll be honest, that 96% number didn't really sound real world to me. But it makes a lot more sense when you understand that it's already looking at people who have good sensor luck. I don't know what to call it. Good sensor usage or it lasts.
Right. Connectivity.
Connectivity. Thank you. That's the word I was looking for.
Yeah.
That makes a lot more sense. There was another study, if I'm reading this correctly, about people with type 1 and type 2 using Control IQ. I didn't know anybody with type 2 was really using it. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, that's pretty cool. So it turns out we have a fairly present segment of our customer base that have insulin-dependent type 2 diabetes. And so, again, first look under the hood, we sort of sat there and we were curious and we said, well, we have some people who are software updating to Control IQ who report that they have type 2 diabetes. I wonder if they're experiencing things differently than folks with type 1 diabetes. And it turns out that both people with type 1 and type 2 diabetes are experiencing significant improvements in time in range with use of Control IQ. So the second publication that we presented at ADA was looking at glycemic outcomes, type 1 versus type 2. Now, you heard me say that folks with type 1 in our analyses experienced a 9 or 10% increase in time in range as a result of their software update. And for folks with type 2, that was a 6% increase in time in range. But here's the really cool part. The analysis that we did for looking at the difference between type 1 and type 2, we required a minimum of 14 days of use leading up to the software update and then 14 days of use after the software update, which is half the amount of time from our first analyses. And so what that means is by seeing that our folks with type 1 got to a 9% improvement in time and range, it means that those improvements are happening really quickly right after the software update.
That's really interesting. I want to dig a little deeper into some of these studies, but I also want to kind of do some bullet points here. So let's talk about Control IQ okayed for young children, because that just happened.
Yes.
Can you speak to what those studies found? Was there anything different or anything parents of children down to the age of 6 now should be thinking about? Anything different?
I don't really think so. We recently, just a couple days ago, got our FDA clearance for the pediatric indication for Control IQ for children 6 or older. Before then, it was previously approved for ages 14 and older. We know investigators have been doing research in even younger populations, but right now we're only approved down to age 6. And what the clinical trial that focused on ages 6 to 13 using Control IQ saw was the sensor time in range increase to 67% from 53% compared to those in the control group. And overnight, children using Control IQ technology in the same study stayed in range an average of 80% of the time. Those glycemic outcomes match what we're seeing in the real world with the slightly older group. And so it's looking very consistent so far across the board.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about these studies, and Tandem isn't the only one who does this. It looks to me like a lot of the automated studies that I'm reading from Insulet and Medtronic and some of the other companies, it was that 68% in range number that you mentioned. Like the people who started went from 68 to 78, which is fantastic. But we know that so many people with diabetes have like 30% time in range, right?
Yep.
They need this technology so badly. And I'm wondering, can you just speak to that in terms of, I don't know, why the studies, and I was glad to hear the kids study was 53% to 67%. Yep. That seems a little bit more realistic to me. I mean, God forbid you study teens. Yeah. But, why do most of these studies take people who frankly have relatively decent control, right? We're talking about the whole sphere of diabetes, not just people who have great technology. I would think you'd want somebody who's got an A1C of 10 and you can say, look, we knocked him down to 6.
That is a great question, and you are speaking my language. I'm so thrilled to hear you ask that question. That was actually one of the biggest themes to emerge from this year's ADA, and it certainly isn't a new theme, but it was a very prominent theme this year, the call for more diversity in research studies. Diversity, whether it has to do with baseline A1C or baseline time in range, where somebody lives. There was a really exciting study presented at the ADA by researchers in New York who looked at inner city urban teenagers onboarding to the t:slim X2 with basal IQ. And that was very cool to see. And so you're absolutely right. It is on us as researchers, as scientists, as clinicians to figure out how to be more inclusive in this type of research. And that's certainly one of our goals here at Tandem.
That's interesting because I thought you were going to say I don't know. I thought it was going to be more on the medical side of it. So in other words, is it more of a question, and pardon my ignorance here, because I wasn't really even sure what I was asking there. Is it just harder to find people to be in these studies, or is it the study criteria that excludes people?
So at Tandem, we try to have the most inclusive criteria that we possibly can. For this year's ADA, again, because we had such a short amount of time and we really only could take, quote unquote, the first look under the hood, we had to work with the data that was available.
Sure.
When you consider early adopters of any technology, really, but certainly early adopters of Control IQ technology, like you said, a lot of those folks were already doing pretty well, especially because most of them were on t:slim X2 with basal IQ leading up to their Control IQ technology update. It's a loaded question, why isn't there more diversity in this type of research? And there's no one simple answer to that question. I think it's a shared responsibility across many communities to figure out how to make it easier for different types of people to be included in this research. So I think the medical community, the research community, the scientific community, and the diabetes community sort of at large, we just need to be better about being more inclusive.
Well, and I think it's very easy once you set the parameter that you looked at people who were early adopters. We know who those early adopters were. They're us. They're people who listen to podcasts. They're people who are super educated. They went for the portal before the email came to them. So it's a it's a very self-selected group of highly educated people. So I'm not being critical. I get it. It's just, gosh, like I said, I'd love to see what happens when you start people who have a very high A1C and don't have a lot of time and don't have a lot of perhaps access to get a technology like this and see what it can do. Because, I'm such a cheerleader. Listen, my bias is showing, but my son has always been in very good health with diabetes. We've been very lucky. You probably know I don't share numbers, but we're on track to have probably his lowest A1C ever. And he has never done less work. It's amazing. So I just hope everybody gets some technology like this.
Yeah, the psychologist and behavioral scientist in me is just thrilled to hear you say that. I mean, for somebody like me who has studied social science her entire career and has also worked in health technology and medical technology my entire career, I like to say that my purpose professionally is to advocate for the humans using the machines. Yeah. And so I want the science to be able to tell the most insightful stories, whether powerful stories like one you're experiencing with Benny, where he's having to do less and less work, but experience better and better outcomes, or whether it has to do with, somehow shining a light on underserved populations who could be the greatest beneficiaries of this type of technology, and how can we make that happen? So all of that to me is very exciting.
It's got to be fascinating for somebody with your background to work in this field where the mental side of diabetes is just as important, and the human factors on pumps. We could talk all day.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so the easiest way to think about it in terms of what I do and my teams do here at Tandem is, as you know, the FDA requires very rigorous human factors testing in order to submit and receive clearance on a medical device. And so my teams do all of the usability and human factors testing prior to our FDA submissions. And then other parts of my teams are the psychologists and the social scientists responsible for doing all the work to understand how the machines are functioning in the everyday lives of everyday users. I feel very blessed to be able to do that for work.
So moving to, heaven forbid we let you rest on your laurels at all. Moving ahead to what may be next. Yes. I know that COVID-19 has delayed a lot of things, in all medical fields. But can we ask about the T-Sport and the Tandem mobile app? Can you talk about where those are right now?
Of course you can ask. So a lot of you know that we have a new insulin pump system that we're working to bring to market next year. We typically refer to it as the T-Sport. That's our internal project name for it. Oh. That's what we've kind of affectionately been calling it while it's been in development. It's about half the size of the t:slim X2. It's being designed to be controlled either entirely by a mobile app or by an independent controller. And you're right, due to the current COVID-19 environment, we have had some delays in some of our human factors testing. Because the data is required for our regulatory filings, the target submission timing for the T-Sport will be pushed out until protective government restrictions are lifted. And because I am the person that oversees our human factors team. Let me just say that trying to plan and carry out human factors testing during a pandemic is one of the most unique challenges of my career.
Wow.
And I know for anybody out there who's attempted to plan anything right now, it's been particularly difficult.
Before we go on, do you believe the T-Sport will have a different name when it launches?
Ooh.
I won't hold you to it. It's just the first time I've heard somebody say that's our like with Omnipod, they said, oh, it's Omnipod Horizon. And they said, no, it's Omnipod 5.
Yeah.
And sometimes we find ourselves getting ahead, right? We're ahead of marketing. We're ahead of labeling. We follow these projects so early that we kind of we as a community assign names to things that don't even have a name yet.
Right. Yeah. I am not a betting woman. And so I would be afraid to put money down on what T-Sport is officially going to be called when it gets commercialized.
All right. Fair enough. We'll just know that that's the working title. And then the mobile app. I know There's some people beta testing the phone app, which is more of a observant app. You look at things. You can't do anything really yet. Is that the same timeline as the T-Sport, whatever that timeline turns out to be?
No, the mobile app is happening on a different timeline. So we're developing a mobile app platform that is the foundation of our digital health strategy. The first generation of the app had a beta launch in the first quarter of 2020, and it will be rolled out more broadly in the upcoming weeks. So the first generation of the app will include remote data upload so that patients can send their HCP's important pump data without an office visit. We know that right now we've kind of been forced into this telehealth world. So that's going to be a really critical part of the user experience. And future iterations of the app will include remote bolus capability. Due to COVID, for sure, we've had some delays in human factors testing on the remote bolus features.
Yeah.
And again, because data is required for our regulatory filings, we have to work with that the best we possibly can.
I'm so excited about that. I mean, obviously, the idea of bolusing from the phone seemed like the holy grail for a long time. But that is exactly what you're saying, right? That the idea here is that you would take out your phone, you would bolus or use the pump, you'd be able to control it from your phone.
That's right.
I'm getting the impression you don't want to talk too much more about that.
Well, I will say, being a scientist who's in charge of doing all of the research makes me an interesting candidate for a podcast interview.
All right. Well, so here's a question for you. And again, no answer is a fair answer. Can't answer is fine. I'm curious, when you start doing things like that, the remote monitoring capability of the Dexcom obviously has been very, very popular. I'm curious if I wouldn't expect to bolus my son from my phone, right? You wouldn't expect a caregiver to be able to do something like that. But would a caregiver be able to see more about the pump? Will there be more information available to people who want to, let's say, follow? I don't know what kind of language you'll be using. Like the pump battery, the insulin on board, all of that kind of stuff. Will that be available?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So follow capabilities through mobile app is certainly a part of our product roadmap. There are plans underway for that. I can't speak to when that would come to the market specifically, but it is being worked on.
Okay, and one more, if you can't answer, this is fine too. Would it be possible, I'm just thinking out loud when my son was younger and we did do everything for him, if like you could designate like this is the bolus phone and it wouldn't necessarily be the phone that's with the kid?
Great question. Cybersecurity is such a critical consideration in this land of remote anything. I can't tell you one way or the other whether or not you as the parent would be able to use your smartphone to bolus, from your son's pump. We'll have to wait and see what the FDA decides in the land of, security and safety and cybersecurity. For sure, right now, we're focusing on doing the necessary human factors testing for enabling the pump wearer to be able to use his or her smartphone.
I'm trying to keep track of the timeline here, so forgive me. Are clinical trials underway for the T-Sport yet?
Right. So for the T-Sport project, we are not yet doing active clinical trials. But as many of you know, being a medical device company, we have a robust R&D department, and our engineers are experimenting on a regular basis.
Ooh, sounds intriguing. You should do all of your studies in Charlotte, North Carolina, and you should include 15-year-old boys. Yeah, let's move on. Do you know, this isn't really your department, a bunch of my listeners had questions about insurance. And a lot of insurers were making noise a few years ago about only going with one pump company. And of course, the big one was United Health and Medtronic. Has Tandem made any progress in that, in that deal?
Right. So like what you said is true. It's not my department. So we don't provide individual payer updates, but we believe having continued positive data on our technology, like what we presented at the ADA, helps with all of our payer discussions.
So I would say, to paraphrase that, Tandem is not going to give up on working with as many insurance companies as possible.
That is correct. We believe in doing whatever we can to create access for as many people in the world as possible.
Another bit of news that came out right around ADA was FDA approval of Libre 2. And you all have had an agreement already with Abbott. I don't know the parameters of the agreement. I don't think there's a lot of public timeline or how it'll work. Can you speak to anything about that, about how sometime in the future, I suppose the Libre will work with the Tandem pump?
Yes. So Abbott and Tandem share a common goal to provide people with new ways to manage their diabetes that can integrate easily into their daily lives. The interoperability landscape is very promising. And Tandem is working with Abbott on an agreement to integrate a future generation of their glucose sensing technology with our insulin pumps. We haven't announced a timeline for the completion of the agreement, but we're working on it.
So dumb question, because I always get confused with interoperability. Would this be a situation where I flip a switch on my pump and one week I could use a Dexcom sensor and the next week I could use a Libre sensor?
I think for some people that is what the vision is like. I think we're all playing an active role right now in forming what this interoperable landscape could be. But conceptually, the idea is you could mix and match your technologies and they would be able to speak to one another. Now, that requires business agreements between the companies as well. So don't forget that part, because that's an important part.
Yeah. Let's keep dreaming. Let's forget the business. So what are you all studying now? Obviously, this isn't the end of the studies on Control-IQ or Tandem products. Can you give us a glimpse into what you're looking at in the next couple of months?
Yeah, sure. Well, as you know, we currently offer the t:slim X2 with Basal-IQ technology and Control-IQ technology. We had some pretty exciting research debut at the ADA on Basal-IQ in that we followed folks who onboarded to Basal-IQ during their first 6 months on Basal-IQ. And that was what we call a prospective study, meaning we were able to follow people in real time over the course of several months to see how it was going for them. The research we presented at ADA related to that specifically focused on self-reported severe hypoglycemia episodes. And we were thrilled to tell the world that Basal-IQ is doing a phenomenal job of decreasing adverse events related to severe hypoglycemia. So Basal-IQ is seemingly doing a very good job at keeping users safe. And, safety is always at the top of our priority list. So as we continue to see more people take on Control-IQ technology, if they choose to do that, we will do these long-term studies where we follow people if they opt in and want us to. We'll follow them while they onboard to and get to know and continue to use Control-IQ technology so that we can learn from them. Again, not just the glycemic outcomes, things like time in range and hypoglycemia, but sleep quality or other things like, is it a hassle to use? Is it making your life better? One of the things that I'll never forget is a couple months after Basal-IQ hit the market, I had the chance to briefly talk with a father who had a 16-year-old daughter, and she had been on Basal-IQ for about 6 weeks. And he looked at me and he said, "This is the most under-promised, over-delivered diabetes technology our family has ever experienced." And I said, "Wow, tell me more about that." And he said, "We're finally sleeping.
Yeah.
We can sleep through the night. And sleep is a precursor to everything for everybody. So we're going to be doing a lot more research on the sleep front to see how we can be better, continue to improve sleep quality for people with diabetes. That's a very big topic of interest for us.
I'm curious, too, if you're looking at how people onboard and adjust to Control-IQ. Because most people, and again, we're biased because we think we're very well educated, right? When we were in Facebook groups and we talk to each other, most people kind of went through the training, talked to their endo, and then did all the troubleshooting themselves over the first 2 to 3 weeks. we're experiencing lows we didn't experience before, so we decreased basal or we increased ISF or whatever people had to adjust. Are you following like common practices to find out how to better teach? Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry.
We are. And in fact, next week, we're putting on a couple of webinars specifically for healthcare providers first, because we've been hearing from them even before we launched into market when we started training healthcare providers on the Control-IQ technology system. We have some best practices now to share now that it's been out there for a couple of months and we've been able to connect some dots. We'll be putting on several webinars next week for healthcare providers where we'll be talking about these best practices and tips and tricks. And we know that not just healthcare providers, but users and their family members want to be able to ask these questions too. So I think Molly told me that maybe she'll be getting together with you again, Stacey, for a future podcast.
Yes, I'm going to be asking her all of these questions, and I'm glad here's a webinar where we can kind of see what the research shows people. But right, we're going to be doing another episode in the near future about best practices. That's great.
Yes, and so Molly's just such a great person to talk with about that. But for sure, I'll send you the information on the webinars next week if you want to chime in and watch. They'll be recorded as well. And we are starting to roll out all of that messaging now.
Oh my gosh, that's wonderful, because I got to tell you, we laughed. We got ours so early. Like I said, who waited for the email, right? We just logged into the portal. That my son's endocrinologist said, hey, let me know what you've learned.
Right.
Let me know how you adjust it.
Yeah, that's true. That's true for my family members as well. So one of my nieces has type 1 and she's now, I think, almost 12. That blows my mind. Yeah. 11 or 12. I can't believe it. And her dad reminds me on a regular basis that she teaches him, about how to use the pump and how to use the technology. And I've heard that from other families as well. Like, well, we went to our endo appointment and I'll say, how was it? Well, we taught her a lot, right. We were able to teach her a lot.
It's so funny. Well, it's also new. It's amazing to realize that we're all kind of doing this together.
The energy and enthusiasm for good that is in the diabetes community is so special and so unique.
It really is.
And so I feel very lucky to be a part of it and to play some small role in trying to make it better for everybody.
I can't thank you enough for jumping on. As I said, I'm kind of a fan, so I don't think this was an unbiased interview. But your information is fantastic, and I thank you so much for jumping on and sharing some of it with us. Thank you so much, Steph.
Absolutely, and I look forward to continuing to listen, to hear how other people, share their experiences, and tell Benny to keep us informed.
No doubt.
You're listening to Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
More information at diabetes-connections.com. The episode homepage always has the transcript and other links that you may need. And I will link up our last episode with Tandem there as well, which was all about the launch of Control-IQ. And as Steph mentioned, we're going to be talking to Molly McElroy-Malloy and others from Tandem. I'm in discussions with them. They've already agreed. It's just a question of scheduling about getting someone to talk about best practices and other questions. You had so many questions for Tandem that are more mechanical about how Control-IQ works that we want to do a second interview and really dig into the nitty gritty, right? How do I know whether I need to adjust basal? How do I know whether it's the carb to ratio issue? And a bunch of questions of what you'd like to see in the next iteration of Control-IQ. So that is coming. Thank you for your patience. But it's always interesting, right, to get a high-level view of what's going on in these companies and to try to look at the timeline as best we can. I also thought it was really interesting that the reminder Steph gave me about how we do kind of get ahead of the curve around here, not just on this podcast, but those of us who are engaged enough to be in Facebook groups and be on conference calls and listen to the investor calls these companies make and feel like we are familiar with the language and the labeling before it's even submitted to the FDA. So I'm interested to see if the name of the T-Sport does change. Frankly, I really like it, but hey, I'm not in their marketing department. So we'll see. Okay, tell me something good coming up in just a moment. But first, do you know about Dexcom Clarity? It is their diabetes management software. And for a long time, I really thought it was just something our endo used, right? It was something we went there and he looked at it. But you can use it on the desktop or as an app on your phone. And it is an easy way to keep track of the big picture. I check it about once a week. Well, to be honest with you, I check it more now. Ever since we flipped over to Control-IQ, I really like to look at it because... And I know this is psychological, right? because it gets better and better. But it really does help me and Benny dial back and see longer-term trends. And it does help me not overreact to what happened for just one day or even just 1 hour. The overlay reports help context to Benny's glucose levels and patterns. And then you can share the reports with your care team, which makes appointments a lot more productive. And it was essential for our remote appointment that we had back in March. It was amazing. Managing diabetes is not easy, but I feel like we have one of the very best CGM systems working for us. Find out more at diabetes-connections.com and click on the Dexcom logo. Tell me something good this week, all about diabetes scholars. We talked about this. I try to let you know when it opens up. This is something that comes from Beyond Type 1, and they give more than 50 scholarships to students living with type 1 diabetes. So it's a combined $150,000. And these are for students who are in the high school class of 2020, entering their first year of college. This was a record number of scholarships for the organization. So a little bit about the kids: 54 outstanding students representing 26 different states. They are advocates, student athletes, scientists, writers, actors, mathematicians, and leaders. Each of them, of course, lives with type 1 diabetes. There is a list of the Diabetes Scholars Class of 2020 that I will link up so you can peruse and see all these fantastic students who are going to change the world as they head off to college at a very uncertain time. Oh, my goodness. And these are significant scholarships. They range from $1,000 for individuals to $5,000. If you have a student who is in high school and you want to check this out, I will also link up how to enter. They do not open again until January. And I should mention that Diabetes Scholars was an independent organization for a long time. But when it kind of seemed like it, I don't know the reasons behind it, I'm not privy to the inside information, but a couple of years ago, it seemed like they were going to go under. And Beyond Type 1 scooped them up and put them under their umbrella. And now they are part of the big Beyond Type 1 family. And that's one of the really interesting things, not to get off the subject here, about Beyond Type 1. You know, when they first started, a bunch of us who'd been around for a while kind of thought, well, what is this fancy new social media feed going to do, right? What is their legacy going to be? What kind of changes are they going to make? And while I think that they have still differentiated themselves by appealing perhaps more to young adults and focusing a lot, I mean, their social media is amazing. They've also now really made a name for themselves by being an umbrella organization for smaller diabetes groups that it's really hard to survive with a low budget when you try to go yourself. Safe Sitting is part of them. I think Slipstream now is part of them. There are lots and lots of Beyond Type Run, lots of little organizations that make a big difference, but needed their help. So I guess that's a Tell Me Something Good as well for Beyond Type 1. If you have a Tell Me Something Good story, I'm in the process of gathering more. I've been putting out the post in the Facebook group and elsewhere. If you have some good news, I want to share it. Just let me know. You can also email me, Stacey at diabetes-connections.com, and tell me something good. I mentioned at the top of the show that we are going to be marking 13 years with an insulin pump in July, really just late next week, July 4th. Yeah, we were geniuses and decided to start it over Independence Day weekend when we were not even at home. That's a story for another time that I have told, that I tell in the book too. But we are also next week headed to the endocrinologist for the first time since January. We did not get an A1C when I had a telehealth appointment for Benny in March. So I'm really interested to see. I mean, I know the drill from Dexcom. And while I don't share numbers, I think we are going to have one of, if not the lowest A1C Benny's ever had. Thank you to Control IQ. But there's always more to talk about when we see the endo than just the numbers. So I will keep you posted on if there's anything that Benny wants me to share or that we want to talk about. But I'm really looking forward to that appointment just because, gosh, we've never gone 6 months without seeing our endocrinologist. And while I know a lot of people think it's a pain to go every 3 months, I mean, I think it's a pain too. But I like checking in. I love Dr. V. I always learn something. We always ask a bunch of questions, even though he sometimes asks me questions now, which is really funny and I do enjoy. I think that when you have a kid who changes as much as my kid has over the years, just physically, and everything else, it's really important, at least for me, to have that kind of touchstone. So I am really looking forward to it. And I think Benny's grown an inch. He thinks he hasn't grown at all. And he won't let me measure him. I mean, how ridiculous. So we'll get the height, which is what I'm looking forward to as well. Okay. We have so many great episodes on tap. I have all this technology stuff. I have some personal stories that I've been holding. It's always a mix around here about the technology, the news, the great stories from our community, camp. Oh my gosh. So there's lots coming up. It's just a question of what comes next. If there's any breaking news, we'll do our very best. But please join Diabetes Connections, the group on Facebook. That is the best way to stay up to date as to what's coming. And I often ask you all questions as well, which helps me figure out what episodes are really important to you. Thank you to my editor, John Buchanan at Audio Editing Solutions. And as always, thank you for listening. I'm Stacey Sims. I'll see you back here next week. Until then, be kind to yourself.
Diabetes Connections is a production of Stacey Sims Media. All rights reserved, all wrongs avenged.